The first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima.
Oh, the humanity!
The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every
Let us
city.
not forget for a moment the toils and efforts that lie ahead.
They say that those who forget their history are condemned to repeat it. This is the History Lessons Podcast with certified financial planning practitioner Patrick Huey, author of History Lessons for the Modern Investor, and your guide to financial wisdom in the past, present, and future. You ready? Good. Let's get historical.
Historical indeed. This is the History Lessons Podcast, and I'm Patrick Huey. I wrote the book, History Lessons for the Modern Investor. And in this episode, we're talking with Jeanne McKinney, author of Triumph Over the Taliban, the untold story of U.S. Marines' courageous fight to save Camp Bastion. Jeanne's an award-winning military journalist as well as a military documentary filmmaker. And her focus and passion are telling the legendary stories about active duty military members in their fight to keep America and her allies safe and free. McKinney offers an inside look at the men and women who do the hard and very dangerous job of counterinsurgency to stop and disrupt the plans of the world's most notorious terrorist groups. She's currently in the final stages of writing, directing, and producing a 3-part documentary series that follows the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines in Afghanistan. McKinney's won numerous San Diego Press Club Excellence in Journalism Awards, including 8 first-place honors. And the President's Own Marine Band performed the original score for her film series at a world premiere in August of 2022. But wait, there's more. Greg Sturdivant enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps in 1975 and was honorably discharged as a sergeant in July of 1979. He then returned to school, received a Bachelor's of Science degree in Business Administration from Southeast Missouri State University, and was commissioned an officer in the United States Marine Corps. Upon completion of the basic school, he reported to Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida for flight training and was designated a naval aviator in April of 1984. General Sturdivant has served in various operational squadrons and assignments, including commanding officer of HMM 165, and he also served as commanding general, 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing Forward, and commanding general, Camp Bastion and Leatherneck Complex from February 2012 through February 2013. In an attack on Camp Bastion, 15 Taliban fighters on 14 through 15 September 2012 killed 2 U.S. service members, Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Rabel and Sergeant Bradley Atwell. 8 others were wounded. Following that attack, Major General Sturdivant and Major General Charles Greganis, the overall commander of Regional Command Southwest at the time of the attack, became the subjects of several investigations into accountability about that attack. On 30 September 2013, General James F. Amos, Commandant of the Marine Corps, asked both Major Generals to retire. General Sturdivant is now the founder and CEO of Mission Critical Leadership Solutions and the author of Mission Critical Leadership, Marine Corps Leadership Principles to Transform and Motivate and Lead Your Teams to Success. Okay, so this is a personal one for several reasons. First, we filmed this interview on Veterans Day. And second, Lieutenant Colonel Chris Rabel and I were friends in college and went through ROTC together. Like Jeanne, I hope that this book and this interview will shed a little more light on his story, as well as the heroic actions of a few Marines in a forgotten battle in the middle of nowhere. As usual, stay tuned for the 3 lessons a modern investor can learn from Jeanne McKinney's Triumph Over the Taliban. All right, so the burning question, I guess, is how did you two come together to tell this story? Because it's an important story. It's one that resonates with me personally, but it's one that a lot of people don't know about. So what is it? How did you two come together, and what put you on the trail of this project?
Well, I got on the trail of the project through a Marine I interviewed. My very first interview of active duty. This is what I've been doing for the last 13 years, is showcasing our active duty and veterans. And he said, well, if you really want a good story, you should check into Camp Bastion. He's a Marine Cobra pilot. He'd been in Marja, and so I said, okay. And then he introduced me to a couple of guys that were there, Stephen B. Slightfoot, and then a few others. And so I just started talking to these guys and having them tell the story of their experience at Bastion. And I began to see this is an incredible battle. And why haven't we heard about it? And so I just kept digging deeper and deeper and stumbled on some alarming investigations. But at any rate, long story short, to meet Greg, I first met Mark, Major General Gerganis. I reached out to him and I said, I'm writing this book. I'd like your participation. I'd like your blessing, basically. And we interviewed, and that all went very well. And then I think, Greg, I reached out to you one time, and I don't know if we connected then, but then I think Greg got on board when Major General Gerganis gave him a call and said, "Hey, she's okay."
So, and Jeannie was persistent. And I was telling Patrick right before he came on the air there, Jeannie, that I was doing a keynote speech here in Reston, Virginia this morning, and I was really focusing on your book, and I talked about you being persistent, because Jeannie reached out to me a couple times, and I really, and I know, how Mark feels about this for Gaines. It was a difficult experience that I didn't necessarily want to relive. But because Jeannie was persistent, I did reach out to Mark Gerganis and said, "What do you know?" And he said, "You should work with her." And that was what really got me over the hump. And then once we started working together, just seeing the amount of passion, and you saw that when you read the book, you could see
Absolutely.
that, you could feel it, the passion, and I mean, she poured her heart and soul into making that happen. And I recognize that, and we've talked about this before, that there's 13 people that were interviewed. This book took 9 years in the making, and she could still be writing because there were so many stories up and down the flight line.
Mm-hmm.
It's more important that she captured probably the most important acts of heroism and selflessness that night, and get the book on the street so that we can have conversations like this, so we can expand the audience and the exposure for people to see what happened after Benghazi. I think, and Jeannie will talk about that. Some of the reason this might not have gotten as much attention was because it was just a couple of days after the Benghazi attack.
Yep. September 14th, 2012, for those who don't know.
Yeah. And so, it's one of those where maybe the government didn't want to highlight the fact that, we've been attacked twice in just a few days. So I'll stop there. But yeah, Jeannie was persistent, got me on board. I'm glad I became part of this project. And it gave her a chance to showcase and highlight some of the heroism that took place that night, because a lot of those Marines didn't receive the recognition that they deserved.
And I think that's an important point, even for somebody who, like me, who does try to keep track of military affairs. I know that got lost in the shuffle back in 2012, because I didn't find out about it until, literally a week to 10 days afterward. And I had friends of mine from college who were involved in that battle. But let's take a step back, and can you both tell me, or tell people who are not familiar with what happened at Camp Bastion in September of 2012, can you give us the forgive the pun, 30,000-foot view?
Well, you want Greg to start?
Go ahead, Jeannie. You got it.
Well,
you only wrote a book about it, Jeannie. I think you could probably.
Right. Exactly. I do have that big view, believe me. I think nobody had it. Okay. That is the big thing, that nobody had that big view, because little bits and pieces came out about the story, and those weren't correct. Everybody was claiming credit. A lot of people were claiming credit that shouldn't have. And then, there was just so many gears ticking on that airfield that night.
Mm-hmm.
But the simple view of it is that the Taliban had been planning to attack the base months before, September 14th, 2012. They were going to do it in the summer. And then during the training, an IED went off unexpectedly and killed some of the fighters. So they had to kind of regroup and push out the date. So it was in the works. When you're in Taliban country, you're never really safe from attack. You look at the size of Camp Bastion, it was massive, 40 square miles, 25 miles of fence line. And how could the Taliban ever think that they could get away with that? Well, those kinds of things just don't stop them. So they planned the attack, and there were a lot of other things going on at the time, because there was a drawdown that the Marine Corps, the 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing, was sent to accomplish, not only fighting, outside of the wire, because there was still a lot of activity, Taliban activity, but pulling out that base. And that was a $60 billion pullout. That was bigger than Iraq to accomplish that. So they had to wear these two hats at the same time, which really complicated things with reduced manpower, much reduced manpower, because Obama started pulling troops out, according to his election promise, even though, in my opinion, they weren't near ready to do that. The Afghan forces weren't ready for us to leave. So basically the Taliban breached the base, which is an uncharacteristic move from Taliban I've studied for years.
Yep.
They usually hide. They hide behind murder holes, and they hide their bombs in the ground. They don't usually come face to face with a wall of Marines. I mean, this is just such a unique battle. And that's one of the reasons. Well, the first thing I saw about it was, this is an incredible battle against, insurgents who waltzed on to a Marine Corps airfield to know they were going to meet a wall of Marines, and started blowing up stuff and killing guys, So, but there's a lot more to the story that I discovered, and that's why I wrote the book, because I felt like it was so incomplete and not to mention unfair. When I first saw that 2 Marine Corps generals were fired, I know Marines very, very well, because I've studied them. I've written about them so much, and they're just part of who I am, even though I'm not a Marine. And I said, that just doesn't add up. Why would 2 career generals get fired over this? It sounds like a political move. And so it was, and so that's the bigger view, is the base was breached. That was uncharacteristic. It happened right after Benghazi, and they were trying to swim their way out of that mess with a bunch of lies. And so it just kind of got lost in the shuffle. And all this heroism of the night just ended up wrapped up in this cover-up. So I set about to uncover it.
Yeah, so that base was considered impregnable by the British, because we were, 40 miles west of the Helmand River, the Green Zone, out in the middle of nowhere. And we had some, before the drawdown, we actually were running pretty aggressive. General Organis was running pretty aggressive patrols on the eastern side of the base, which is where the attack came from, which is where the poppy fields were. And because the drawdown, our end strength for the Marines in RC Southwest, the fighting force went from 17,000 down to 7,400 between February and the beginning of September. So we lost a lot of bodies along the way. Most of them were, the aviation combat element was downsized. It was cut probably by 70%. Our mission didn't change, but our end strength did. And General Gurganis went back and asked for additional bodies, right? A force management level, an FML increase, was like 200 people or something. And it was all tied to a unit that could go out and continue to patrol the eastern side of the airfield. And that request was denied. So, we recognized there was security issues. We couldn't do anything about it. But the other thing that took place about that same time, and I went back and I never could, Jeanne might be able to find this. I couldn't find it. But when she talked about the Taliban attacking the base, which was unheard of, you had 3 5-man teams that were identically outfitted, right, with the same kit. They were all wearing U.S. Army uniforms. They had tennis shoes on, and they were wearing masks because they were huffing and all. But around that same time, in the Stars and Stripes, I remember reading an article about Taliban special forces. And I went back after the fact and looked and looked and looked, could not find that article, but I swear it was in Stars and Stripes. And it was about Taliban special forces. And I went, holy cow, that's how I would describe the unit that attacked Bastion and Leatherneck that night. Well trained, well led. They had good comms. I mean, they were ready to go, and it was very different from what we were used to seeing on the battlefield.
And I want to come back to that in a second, but you mentioned some of the intel that led up to this point. That first of all, it was very obvious that your perimeter was decreasing because of these poppy fields. Your lines of fire were obstructed, and you were getting intel that there could possibly be an attack. Is that correct, or am I misremembering the timeline?
You go ahead, Jeannie.
Well, the intel that Major General Gurganis and his team, which consisted of a British officer and some other officers, they got intel daily, and so there was supposedly no knowledge of an attack where the Taliban would actually come in on the ground, but maybe drive a vehicle in, because that had been happening on other bases throughout Afghanistan. It happened 2 months before the attack on Camp Bastion. So there was a lot of problems that led up to the complacency, and it wasn't on our side. It was on the British side. It was their base, and we were guests there, basically, using the airfield. We had Leatherneck there, but the airfield was British.
Can you go into that a little bit? Just what that arrangement was like between the two forces, why it existed?
Well, I mean, both Greg and I can talk about this, but there's this thing called the 2011 Memorandum of Understanding, and that was an agreement that was put together before Greg and Mark and Third Ma came there, and it was a security arrangement, basically an inept one at that, because it divided pretty much the British from the U.S. forces and their areas of responsibility, and it was kind of complex and confusing about who had to do what. And basically, parts of the MOU set it up so if the base were ever attacked, that the British would be in charge of defending the airfield. That was assigned to them in the MOU, that their security included the airfield and Camp Bastion. Our security included Camp Leatherneck and outside the wire, which was called Bella Wood, and patrolling that right outside the wire, because you got to realize the airfield here's the airfield, and then there's a wire fence, and then just miles of terrain, right, until the villages that got too close. And so one of the British generals that was in command at ISAF, which was the umbrella command of Greg and Mark on the base, they even thought that the agreement was suboptimal, but it basically didn't. It violated Marine Corps protocol by putting another force, international force, in charge of our forces, basically. Right. And that didn't sit well with Mark. I'm going to call him Mark because I get tongue-tied saying Major General Gurganis. So I'm going to call him Mark. But that didn't sit well with him at all, as the leader of Regional Command Southwest. And he complained about that. And they just kind of said, hey, deal with it. This is what it is. We're not going to change it. He went all the way up to ISAF. And then there's this thing called national caveats, that every force that comes into a country to fight an enemy, a foreign country, they have protocol, right? And every force has different protocol. And so there were things that limited Mark and Greg by these national caveats that weren't the same for the American forces and for the British. And so they did what they could with the control that they were given, but it wasn't enough for Mark anyway. And yet they did whatever they could, but it was a bad situation that they came into when they deployed over there. It was the security situation was the British had tried the making friends with your Taliban neighbors kind of thing. There was villages that were encroaching right up to the fence line where they had unimpeded observation of the airfield. So they could stand there and watch airfield operations. Aircraft would come in to land and they'd get shot at. And then there were little things, there were incursions that happened before the attack that were caught on camera and by British patrols where people actually got into the base and were, nosing around, checking things out, including the towers. Mm-hmm. So the MOU was not set up to really succeed, and the attack on Camp Bastion was proof of that. And that's a lengthy discussion, but once they discovered that the enemy was on base inside the wire, and that did not take long. What's so amazing about the response is these Marines weren't sitting around scratching their heads. They immediately figured it out all over the airfield. They were doing something different. Their logistics, or they were sleeping, or it's 10 o'clock at night, and they all heard the explosions of the first Harrier jets that went up. And so they said, hey, that doesn't make sense. They all thought controlled det, and det is a detonation of enemy ordnance that they do when they collect enemy ordnance. And so they thought, no, wait a minute, it's late at night. And then they just, kept hearing explosions. And I thought it was quite amazing that all the Marines put it together real fast. And then with Marine Corps training, like it is, and the chain of leadership that the Marine Corps sets up, they just went into action, and all these little scattered pieces. This is what nobody had until I wrote my book. All the scattered pieces all over the airfield came together in this puzzle where you could see what really happened all over the airfield.
And I thought that was very well done on your part, by the way, because it is, I'm going to say this and don't think that it's pejorative, but the book jumps around a lot. You're jumping from scene to scene where people are, coming into contact with the attack, and you're telling their backstory, and then you're bringing them forward, back into the line of fire. I thought that was very well done. As somebody who's written a little bit, and it's very difficult to do and do well. So that was a cool part of it.
Yeah, there was a lot going on that night, and it was pretty crazy. And I watched. So
I will say, though, having trained with the Marines, I'm not surprised at all on the reaction on their part. And knowing at least one of those guys personally, I'm certainly not surprised.
Well, and we advertise every Marine a rifleman, and that's not just a tagline. That's reality. And in Jeannie's book, when you get to the firefighting piece, you've got the 50,000 gallon bag of fuel going up, and I mean you can see this thing from miles away. It's huge, and you've got American Marine firefighters fighting the fire, and other firefighters fighting the enemy with their M4s and all. And the Brits, their firefighters are just that. They are firefighters. They didn't pick up rifles. That's not their job. Their job is to fight fires, plain and simple. They don't have that additional training that we provide every single Marine. I mean, just like, in boot camp, you learn the tactics in officer candidate school and the basic school. When we get to the basic school, most of that 6-month basic training is to prepare us to be platoon leaders. So that if the infantry platoon leader is killed and I'm the air officer for that unit, I can take charge of the unit and lead them and have an understanding of infantry tactics. So, and you'll see it throughout the book, Marines putting down their wrenches, their tools, whatever it happened to be, putting on their flak jackets, and the body armor, the helmet, grabbing their weapons, and away they go. And it's absolutely amazing the response that took place, because you think about, there was 2% illumination that night, and it was very, very confusing. Right? Once the bullets started flying, you've got Taliban inside the wire. We had a bomber come overhead right away, an MQ-9, and I appreciate the MQ-9 was very valuable because of the drone feed, but a bomber can't bomb inside the fence line. They are danger close. It's not happening.
Yeah.
So really, and we'll let Jeannie talk about that in a minute or when you get to the question. the response really came from rotary wing close air support, and that's what
Yeah.
had to take place. I mean, in the middle of the fight, the U.S. Marine Aviation combat elements responding. The Brit Apaches come back from another mission. They're asked to stand off because our aviation assets are already engaged, and it was so confused. Smoke and reduced illumination. I mean, it was absolutely crazy. But the unity of command that Jeannie just talked about is something that violates the principles that we use in the Marine Corps for the command piece. You should have unity of command. And afterwards, and Jeannie may know the answer to this. I don't know the answer. I don't know if Mark has said we're doing it and I'm in charge of everything and we're not going to have an argument over it, or whether he actually got permission. But after that, he did take charge. He put me in charge of security. And the Brits had an interesting response because I had a number of flag officer visits from British officers wanting to retake the lead for security for Bastion and Leatherneck.
Mhm.
And the conversation went like this: it's not going to happen. You violated our trust and confidence. We don't have trust in your ability to get the job done. You're welcome to provide an 06, either a colonel or a Navy captain deputy, but we're going to continue to have the lead for security.
Do you have a sense on why that was so important to them?
So, I don't. I think part of it was, Bastion was there before Leatherneck. The Brits were there before we were.
Okay.
And when we flowed in, initially, they granted some additional space for us, and I just think it was just pride of ownership. But they lost sight of, and you think about they not only put their war fighters at risk, they put us at risk.
Sure.
And I didn't find out. I mean, because my focus was not on security. And it was, but it wasn't. And I mean, I got criticized from one of my best friends when he read the investigation. He said, "You didn't do yourself any favors," because a number of questions that were asking me, I said, "Not my job." And that you didn't do yourself any favors. They asked, I'm like, "Hey, here's the problem." They asked me the exact same questions they were asking my boss, and we had different roles and responsibilities. You need to ask me a different set of questions, and that was part of the conversation. Did we have responsibility for security? Absolutely. Every person on that base had a certain level of responsibility for security. Right? My main function was not securing the fence line. My main function was aviation combat power projection.
Right. Plain
Plain and simple. Air to ground munitions, moving supplies, moving people. It was not on security. After the attack, and after General Grigani put me in charge of security, and I started asking some questions, and it comes out in the book. Jeannie's going, "Hey, they've got all the 24 towers. They weren't all manned." Like, what do you mean they're not all manned? Some were manned, some weren't. Where they came to the finish line between 16 and 17 were manned by Tongans, who have been suspected of watching Netflix or whatever instead of doing their job. So you got that going on. I take over security. I talked to the Brits about doing some random firing, because on the west side of the base was a range that went all the way down the entire west side of the base and kind of wrapped around half of the southern end of the base. And we're firing munitions all night long, day and night. So nobody's going to come through there. Scrappers might try and get out there to get some scrap metal, but there's no fighting force going to be able to penetrate that. So you've got that going on. And oh geez, I just lost my train of thought. I lost it. Where was I going? You can tell me.
The fog of war.
Yeah, that's what I've got, is the fog of war. All right.
No, you were talking about the security arrangements post attack. Yeah.
So thank you. So get me back on track. I appreciate that. So you can't penetrate the west side or the half the southern end, but on the eastern side now it's post attack. I said, what I want you to do is we're going to have and so after the attack, they actually came out and plowed the poppy fields. After Mark Arganis had asked numerous times, please remove the poppy fields so we've got good fields of fire, and we can see what's going on. So once that comes out, I tell the Brits, I want you to do random firing from the towers out at different spots out in the middle of nowhere. We can't do that. What do you mean you can't do that? Well, turns out they actually their rules of engagement are more, they're police officers.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what? I'm like, I'm going to have to bring Marines over here to get up in the tower and do random, firing just to keep the enemy off bounds. Yeah, that's what it's going to take. Because the Brits could not do that because there was no perceived threat necessarily. If you see somebody coming with, an RPG up, I guess you can shoot them. Short of that, you can't just do a random fire just to keep people at bay. So
Yeah, what the story brought to mind for me are really the two, I think, major issues in modern warfare that we face as a country. One is the do more with less mentality, which you can argue goes back to 1776, but it's certainly not getting any better, and it's not to the detriment of the people that we put in harm's way. We're asking more of them than ever before, and a lot of times giving them less support. And the other thing that jumped out at me was just this constant emphasis on joint operations and working with the idea of making sure that this is an international effort, that it doesn't just look like it's the United States leading the way, which it most certainly is, but just that constant focus on the way things look. And those are the two things that really jumped out at me from this book that I don't think are sustainable in a modern conflict.
Well, I mean, the way it looked was super important, as you know, from what happened to Mark and Greg afterwards. It was all about the optics, the political optics of the whole battle. When they were saying basically it was a failure, when it was a shining success, I mean, Marines were making critical decisions on the spot. And in an uncertain environment, you think of a aircraft, these, lethal aircraft in the air, our aircraft on our own base, right? So, and they don't know where the enemy is. It's dark as heck. And the enemy are scattered all over the place. All they could brilliantly just found out where they were by, determining the direction of tracer fire and versus the color of our tracer fire versus enemy tracer fire, which is ours red, theirs green. And that's one of the ways they determine where the enemies were shooting from. But this legacy battle, these critical decisions that made the Marine Corps shine, in their response to a surprise attack. It's one thing to go out with a plan, out into the battle zones, and then have your contingencies and your QRFs all lined up and CASVACs all lined up. But when the enemy is at your back door, that's a whole different matter. And the political optics became all it was. And many times in war, it's about who's going to vote for me the next election. Because, Obama was up for re-election 2 months after the attack, right? He had Benghazi, then he had Bastion. Not good. And then he promised the American people he was going to bring everybody home, even though it wasn't time to bring everybody home. Yeah,
another bad idea I think that we've learned in the last couple of years, I hope that we've learned, is to announce your withdrawal before you actually withdraw. I agree. Totally. It's a wonderful political statement, but it does absolutely nothing for the guys and gals on the ground who have to execute it. Well, if you read in the prologue of my book by, Lieutenant General James Terry, who was Army and commanding and a commander in ISAF, he said exactly that. He said, because the timeline of the withdrawal was announced, it gave the Taliban all kinds of time to regenerate and regroup and plan their operations. And they stayed really busy all that time, making sure their presence was known to the locals and doing what they do. Mark's regional command, his forces came in and they put a dent in all that. And they disrupted their plans, they disrupted their financing. But still, when you announce that you're coming out, what do you think the enemy is going to do? They're going to leverage that to the hilt. Yep. I totally agree. That should not be announced.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. So, Patrick, I think, I think one of the lessons learned from this particular operation really was, we talk about the unity of command and got it. Mark asked to bring everybody together, was denied. But I think where we where we missed the mark maybe was the national caveats that Jeannie was talking about, understanding exactly what the Brits could and could not do. And I will tell you, like I said, I didn't have visibility at the time on the tower situation because that's unacceptable. And for what reason they did that, I don't know. But I think the future, as we move forward and our services are downsizing, we used to have the luxury of overlap. And we still have some of that capability overlap between, Marine Corps aviation, Navy aviation, Air Force, the Army. But, we just can't afford to do as much as the redundancy that we used to have. So, and we're working more towards a joint fighting force, and we're having more large scale exercises, and we're participating. All the services are participating. I think that's really important for us to be successful in the future, because so much of that's how you avoid mistakes. I understand, you being a Navy F-18 pilot, coming off the carrier, understanding what the ground guys are doing over here and how you can best support them.
Well, I only knew that because I went to TAC-P at Camp Lejeune and became a forward air controller. So, which is to your point, you only get the appreciation for what those folks are going through on the ground if you go through some of the training and meet them and talk to them. Right. And then, boy, you are super freaking motivated when you go off the end of the boat to get it right.
There you go. And so we have all the services and the Joint Force out of the Joint Staff J7, I think. You've got a senior mentor program. And part of what the retired generals and admirals do is participate in these large scale exercises. And it really is about educating the fighting force. So, retired Marine generals, I expect retired Marine generals to go out and advocate and educate people on the Marine Corps. These are the mission sets we can do. This is a good fit for us. General Charlie Flynn, who's a 4-star Army general who's focusing on the Pacific, what can the Marine Corps provide him as the warfighter, right? Because we're not going to be in the lead. It's going to be that Army 4-star. So what can the Marine Corps do to support him and help him better understand, his staff better understand what we're capable of doing and what we can do so we don't have gaps, seams and gaps. We're able to seamlessly employ our warfighting force across all the different services, including, cyber, it's space, it's the Coast Guard, everyone.
I think that's a really interesting point because concurrent to reading Jeannie's book, I'm reading Jack Carr's book about Lebanon, the 1983 Marine barracks bombing. And a great example of a fighting force being put in a no-win position and, kind of thrown into the middle of the fire without a way to defend themselves or a way to get it right, or even a mission to accomplish and a stop date to what they were doing. So, I think that those lessons of history are unfortunately written in blood, and we keep having to be reminded of them.
Absolutely. One thing I'd like to bring up is that I think that people back home in glass offices should listen to their commanders on the ground. They're the ones that know the situation. They're the ones that see the day-to-day operations, the day-to-day challenges. And when they tell you they need something or something's wrong, those people back in Washington should listen. They should, they're there for a reason, right? They're there to lead. Camp Bastion was targeted as failed leadership when it was absolutely the opposite. It was.
Well, and when's the last time you saw anybody in one of those glass offices get fired?
Yeah,
exactly. When does that happen? That the accountability runs up, the political chain of command, so to speak. So I agree 100%.
Yeah, and so then they look down to the people on the ground and say, "It's your fault. Mm-hmm. It's your fault. The Taliban got on the base." No, the Taliban outsmarted us, but that happens. It's like, Major General Gurganis says, you can't always predict everything the enemy's going to do, but you have to be ready to deal with whatever they do.
We talk about that a lot, especially on this show. History is always 2020 vision, but it's the only place where it's always 2020 vision. And especially when you're sitting out in the sandbox, hundreds of miles from anybody else, you don't know. You can't know every tactic or every trick that will get played on you in order to get that access to the base.
And what
I
led
mean,
to right before that attack took place, and Jeannie touched on this earlier, that spring of 2012 is when the insider attack started happening.
Yeah.
And it was really what we perceived to be a bigger threat. It was going to be something inside the wire. And we had thousands of third country nationals working on our base. We had contractors, we had third country nationals, mostly from Pakistan in the dining facilities and all. So, they had easy access to the base itself inside the fence line, and that was a bigger concern. When you read and you saw in Jeannie's book the Burning Man incident, that happened. That just further kind of reinforced the insider threat piece being a bigger concern. And really, on the intel side, Jeannie, I don't think you uncovered anything, and I know, to the best of my knowledge, we didn't really have any advance warning that they were capable of attacking the base.
well, the only thing I could say to that, Greg, is that, and this came out of the British investigation, is that it was known that about the accident, the training accident, where the Taliban, got killed. Couple of recruits were killed during some training operation. That was intelligence that was floated around back in summer. And of course, they should have known about other insider attacks happening on other bases in Afghanistan, because they kept happening, green on blue, right?
Right.
And so that was always an issue for you guys. And you knew that better than me, but that was definitely an issue. You have to realize that it wasn't just US and British on Camp Bastion, it was also Afghan forces. They had a little corner of the base too.
Absolutely.
And that was another job that our forces, that, aviators, that came in to conduct counterinsurgency operations 24/7, 2 shifts a day, and then start pulling out all the base, all the equipment, every piece of airfield matting. We didn't leave anything behind on that base like we did at Bagram.
Right.
And then they had to make sure the Afghan forces were trained and properly. And then there was a litany of other things that were given to the command to help the Afghan government do this and that,
I believe we call that mission creep.
Yeah, right. It's just, if they could just focus on fighting the enemy, which is what they're trained to do, then we probably wouldn't have these gaps. But there was only so much manpower that Third Ma had, and that was it. And they were told, just make do. They just had to make do, and they did. They instituted changes they could have control over, like, vetting at the entry control points, taking away cell phones when they came on base. It was like a little city in there. But what I wanted to say is that the Brits had a whole different mindset than the Marines did, from what I saw in my research. The whole Hearts and Mind campaign over in Afghanistan kind of backfired at that point, because Taliban are always going to be where poppies are, and that's just a given. That's how they fuel the insurgency. And so you've got poppies right along the fence line like that. There's Taliban in those villages watching and observing. And maybe they were special forces. And I'll just make a note there, Greg, that I actually spoke with an Afghan officer. This is way before I did the book. Well, it's during the time I was writing the book. And he was part of Afghan special forces. They did have special forces. And I was shocked when I talked to him, and I was going to interview him and write a story about it. And we communicate back and forth. And then all of a sudden he just stopped, which probably like, hey, you can't do that. You can't talk to an American journalist. But yeah, they did have Afghan special forces over there that they were training. And so maybe that group was, part of special forces. that came in because the normal Afghan fighter wouldn't have, advanced skills like that, or probably, I don't know. They do have courage that blows my mind.
Yeah.
Because they'll go up against the greatest fighting forces in the world. That we're way more technologically advanced, and although they're making strides, and yet that doesn't stop them, and they manage to do so much harm, with what they have. But the mindset of when you go into a foreign country, and Greg could talk about this better than me, is that you're going in the middle of an enemy entrenchment. That the Taliban was entrenched all over Helmand province. It was probably the most volatile area throughout the war because a lot of poppy was grown there. Mm-hmm. They got a lot of money off of opium that was coming out of that region, and they wanted to protect that, right? They didn't want anybody coming in and stopping them from growing their poppies that would fuel the insurgency. And so our troops were a threat. And but it was great, to show that. I think the biggest job, Greg, maybe you can weigh in on this, was to show the local people, the people that actually lived there that weren't a threat, that were just trying to live their lives. And that we were not there to hurt them. We were there to help them. Mm-hmm. And the Taliban were the threat. And then on the other hand, you've got the Taliban going into the villages, talking to the local governors and elders and saying, if you do this, we're going to kill you. We're going to kill your family. If you help them, we're going to kill you. We're going to kill your family. And so all those Afghan allies that we had, and even the Afghan forces themselves, were all at risk. And who knows what's happened to them now to be killed mm-hmm. by the Taliban or have their family members killed. So that took a lot of courage on their part. But Afghan forces are never going to be Marines, right? We can train and train and train. Marines are Marines. They're so different from any of the other forces. And I've talked to, every branch has its specialty, right? And talents and skills. And that's good because they all complete each other. So when they go into a country like Afghanistan, and everybody was there, Army, Navy, Coast Guard, everybody was there, including 50 other nations, and how to put all that
including
together.
Me in 2001.
Yeah. Greg has some good stories about what he was doing at that time. But it was a huge coalition up against this insurgency, and they were mm-hmm. drawing fighters from all over the place. It wasn't just Taliban. It was Al-Qaeda. It was criminal gangs, mafia, you name it. Anybody who wanted to take a pot shot at U.S. forces.
Can we, so we spent some time at the 30,000 foot view. I wanted to maybe zero in on some of the stories, the more individual stories from that day, that night. As Jeannie and I talked about, Chris Rabel and I went to college together. We trained together. I probably saw him last in Pensacola, when we were going through primary flight training. He was well ahead of me, but I did see him at that time. He was an old drinking buddy from college. We hoisted a few beers at CJ Barney's in downtown Oakland. And when I heard about his death, I was obviously shocked. More so because Chris was one of those guys that you would look at and swear that nothing was ever going to touch him. He was just a naturally buoyant, heroic son of a bitch. So it was a little bit shocking to hear what happened to him. But the story is consistent with the guy I knew, which is when stuff started exploding and when rounds started coming down range, he was driving towards it. So can you talk a little bit about what those individual stories are from that night that really stuck with you? Just because I do think that that's a big part of that book is seeing through the eyes of the individual as the explosions are happening and the rounds are coming down range, and Marines do what Marines do. They improvise, adapt, and overcome.
And I'm going to let Jeannie take the lead on this because I think her answer is going to reinforce your perception of Chris Rabel when you knew him, at school in the ROTC program, being fearless and indestructible. So he was heroic that night. So over to you, Jeannie.
Well, you said this, Greg, to me one time. You said there were so many heroic moments throughout the night that never were recognized until, I wrote the book.
Yep.
From Chris jumping in his vehicle, charging up to, his headquarters and rallying his Marines and saying, you want to be Marines? Then come on, follow me. We're going to go out there and fight. They didn't really know.
I'm sure there were a few expletives in there too.
Yeah, there were. Yeah, there definitely were. But he just fearlessly went out there and faced the unknown. Basically, they didn't really know how many enemy were on base, exactly where their positions were, what they were armed with exactly. But they went out and started shooting back and showing force. And unfortunately, this was all in the beginning when there were a lot of unknowns. And then when he went back in to get some more Marines to come on out, an RPG came flying his way, and he got hit with some sort of shrapnel right in the neck. And that was an instant death. And then some of the other Marines that were around him were also injured. But he fighting like a Marine, and he never really got recognized properly for that kind of courage, a bold-faced courage to just go out there and say, F you, we're coming to get you kind of thing. And then also with Sergeant Atwell, he was mobilizing his Marines way over on the other side, the west side of the base, where the MB-22s and the fuel farm and all that was. You can see that in the maps that I had drawn up in the book. But as far as favorite stories, it was hard because I know I had to leave out a lot of great stories. I couldn't get to everybody on that airfield. But I got to the people who had direct engagement with the enemy, and to the very end. And even when you look at these firefighters, that story had never been told. That part of the battle, nobody ever focused on that. And I talked to the leader of MWSS 273, and he was still in the Marine Corps at the time when I interviewed him. And he was just distraught that his Marines never got the recognition they deserved, because there were so many heroic moments in that group of firefighters. They were Marines and they were firefighters, just like Greg said. That's a unique combination. You're fighting a giant fuel fire that is threatening there were 6 bags. There were 6 50,000-gallon bags in a fuel pit. And then all the firefighting equipment and the infrastructure, the buildings around it, they lost some of that. But fighting a fuel fire is one thing, but getting shot at while you're fighting it is another. And yet those Marines didn't back down. And then not only that, they were protecting the civilians in their midst. And so that was their first thing that they did, is form a defense around those civilian contractors and move them from location to location, so nobody was killed. So after the deaths in the beginning of Chris, Lieutenant Colonel Rabel and Sergeant Atwell, there were no more friendly deaths after that because of what the Marines did. The British, you got to read the book to see some of the British involvement, but really it was a Marine Corps battle.
Yeah.
Definitely. It was Marine Corps, and the British had participation, but they kind of got in the way because nobody knew where the enemy was, and you can't have British aircraft, Marine Corps aircraft up there over the base trying to do the same thing. Somebody's going to get shot that's not supposed to get shot. And then on the ground, there was some hesitancy with the response that British came in, and Major McDonald, he had a time. He asked help. He was running up the fight line at first in his skivvies. He came out of the LSAs and was like, saw the explosions up on the VMA flight line, and said, okay, I got to get up there. Runs down, didn't even go back into his room. He had his M9. And along the way, he's borrowing clothes and boots, and he eventually traded his pistol, and he's confronting Taliban along the flight line as he runs up to finally reach there, and becomes sort of like a forward air controller telling Coker up in the helo, the Huey, where they are and where exactly the remaining Taliban were. And then even that move to bring your helicopter down and hover about 100 feet over the enemy with guns, and their gunner on the Gatling guns totally exposed.
Mm-hmm.
Even that was so risky and dangerous. They never do that. They never bring helicopters into a hover over the top of the enemy, right? And so it's hard to pick a favorite story. It's all my favorite story to every single Marine that was out there, even the ones I don't know, because they shone that night, and it just chapped me that battle had to be smothered in a blame, that they failed because, I'm sick of the government saying that our veterans failed over there. The government failed them, in my opinion. I'm sorry, I'm a little vocal about that, but they didn't fail. They went over there and did their jobs. They went on the missions, and they, got killed and lost their limbs, and came home with PTSD and everything else under the sun. How can you say they failed? They did not.
I think, 20 years of people fighting in Afghanistan, we're questioning, I lost a limb. My son or daughter, my friend, my brother, sister lost their life defending our country and fighting in Afghanistan. For what reason?
Yep.
And that's a hard pill to swallow. And I think a lot of people, myself included, would argue we should still have fighting forces on the ground in Afghanistan. And it's not a large force, but they're fighting out of Bagram.
Yep.
And they're providing, we're doing intel and aviation support, in support of the Afghan National Army. And if we had done that, we might have had a different outcome.
I haven't heard a whole lot of arguments counter to that.
Yeah, I mean,
in my circle.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
And and the sad part about it is,
but again, obvious in retrospect, right? 2020 hindsight. However, announcing your withdrawal ahead of time.
Well, and if you're going to do that, at least do the steps in the right order.
Yeah.
So there's 5 steps. You got to do 1, and then 2, and then 3, 4, and then 5. Not, mix them up. And I mean, you bring General Miller out, right? Scotty Miller had been on the ground in Bagram in Afghanistan, in Kabul rather, for almost 2 years. 4-star Army general. They turned command over to Frank McKenzie back in Tampa, Florida, the CENTCOM commander. All right, that was the beginning of the end there, I would argue, because you think about the day-to-day relationship that General Miller had with the president of Afghanistan, and now you pull him out, and the guy that's now in charge is thousands and thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
It just didn't make sense. But anyway, back to hindsight 2020, but still, that was predictable. I told when we were doing that withdrawal, I said this is the most dangerous thing we've done. The entire time we've been in Afghanistan, this is the most dangerous thing we've ever done because of the large crowds and small fighting force, and they're trying to control the flow and access onto the base, having no idea who the bad actors are.
Yeah.
You saw what happened, and it came at such a high cost.
Well, and military history 101, whether it's Sun Tzu or Clausewitz, I can't remember, but you never give up the element of surprise. And to announce a withdrawal and tell them exactly how many people are coming out and when they're coming out, just doesn't make sense to me.
Well, and like Jeannie said, they play the waiting game. Hey, this gives me a chance to reconstitute my
Yeah,
forces.
absolutely.
We'll slow down. We'll do a little bit just to keep them occupied. But in the meantime, we're going to train some additional forces and be ready to go. So, all right, back over to you. Go ahead, Jeannie.
So,
Well,
Jeannie,
I was just going to say, I believe I am certain, because I've been told this and I've seen this, that the enemy, the insurgent enemy, the terrorist enemy, only respects power.
yeah,
As soon as you weaken or you open up gaps, they're going to fill them. They're not going to stop. We're never going to eradicate them from the face of the earth, but we can keep them down. And we did. And this is the thing I wanted to speak to veterans of Afghanistan, that it wasn't a waste of time. None of it, to me, was a waste of time, because we won a lot of the smaller wars over there in Helmand province, in the north, in Kandahar, you name it, all the different bases and outposts all over that country.
mhm.
We won a lot of smaller wars. We came in and we kicked their butts, and nobody talks about that because of what happened at the end and what a political failure that was, when
Yeah.
political people decided had to pull out of Afghanistan and not listen to the people on the ground. And so veterans need to know of that Afghanistan war, that their lives, their limbs meant something. And because, number one, we never saw another attack on the homeland during that 20 years, right? They didn't even try it. Right now, guess what? Where Camp Bastion that's a new training camp for Al-Qaeda. And some of the Hamas fighters came there to train. There's Al-Qaeda safe houses and training camps all over Afghanistan now, because we're gone. If we were there, like Greg said, that wouldn't be happening there. So I just hope on this Veterans Day that they can know that they did a lot of good, and that all of their efforts are appreciated by Americans back home. And if leaders like Greg and Mark could have led to the extent of their knowledge and their wisdom, that there would not have been an attack on Camp Bastion, in my opinion. Not like that, because they would have taken care of business if they were to have been allowed to. And this is the problem, though. Like Greg said, when you combine forces on a base, you're going to have some issues. So, sorry, kind of went on a rant there.
No, it's okay. And quite honestly, I don't know how we would improve on that statement. So let me just say thank you both for coming on, spending Veterans Day with me. And let me also say happy Veterans Day, General Sturdivant. Happy Veterans Day to everybody out there who served and everybody who is continuing to serve. And happy Veterans Day to you, Jeannie, who are keeping the stories alive. And that is important, especially in this day and age. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Patrick.
Here are 3 lessons then for the modern investor from Jeanne McKinney's Triumph Over the Taliban. Number 1, joint projects require a lot of communication and don't always work out. It's important to work with other people occasionally, even as an investor, but splitting up the responsibility for various portions of your portfolio is not likely a winning strategy. Having all of your eggs in one basket is known to be an issue. But that does not mean splitting your investments among a variety of advisors is best. You can get plenty of diversification at the tactical level with your individual investments. In the end, someone needs to be responsible for overall strategy and not be working at odds with the other managers. As we saw in the tragic example of Camp Bastion, such attempts at integrating different rules of engagement can lead to major gaps in your defenses. Number 2, don't try to do more with less. As an investor, it's crucial to recognize that wanting to do so often leads to unnecessary strain and below optimal outcomes. Imagine a retirement investor who decides to manage their entire portfolio themselves to save on advisor fees, okay? Despite having little investment knowledge or time. They attempt to pick individual stocks, they chase market trends, and they try to time the market, believing this will maximize their returns. However, without the proper research, tools, or expertise, their decisions are, let's just say, inconsistent and often poorly timed, leading to losses and missed opportunities for growth. See, trying to do more with less could jeopardize their retirement goals. So allocate your resources wisely, get professional advice, and a strategic coach to find the right mix of tactics for you. Third and finally, avoid mission creep. For investors, it's easy to get sidetracked in a world with so much noise. Avoiding mission creep as an investor requires maintaining a disciplined focus on your original investment strategy and goals. It's easy to get sidetracked by attractive opportunities outside your expertise or tempted to chase trends that may not align with your long-term objectives. To stay on course, regularly revisit your investment thesis, I hope you have one, and ensure that any and all new opportunities fit within your risk tolerance and your overall strategy, and resist the urge to over-diversify without purpose. By sticking to your core principles and having a clear framework for evaluating decisions, you can avoid diluting your efforts and protect your portfolio from unnecessary risk. Yeah, your goals may change as time goes on. No problems there. Just make sure that your planning changes with it. You need that kind of clarity when the fog of war creeps in. Well, my fellow historians, that is all for this episode. Be sure to pick up Jeanne's book on Amazon. Grab Greg's as well. And while you're on Amazon, check out my book too. That's History Lessons for the Modern Investor. Then be sure to do all the social stuff. Like this episode, follow us wherever you see or hear your podcasts. We're available as usual on Substack, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Until next time, when we'll take another rollicking romp through the past and make an investment in your future with history lessons for the modern investor. Goodbye, everybody.